All right, let's go.
Number 10. The Kola Superdeep Borehole, the deepest hole ever drilled. What was down there broke every model. In 1970, the Soviet Union began drilling a hole in the Kola Peninsula in northwest Russia near the Norwegian border. Their goal? Reach as deep into the Earth's crust as possible. Pure science. No oil, no minerals, just a hole to see what was down there. They drilled for 24 years. The borehole reached a final depth of 12,262 meters, over 12 kilometers in 1989. It remains the deepest human-made hole on Earth as of 2026. Its diameter at the bottom is just 23 centimeters, a hole narrower than a dinner plate, reaching deeper than the highest point of the Himalayas is tall. What they found shattered the prevailing models of Earth's interior. The model at the time predicted that below 7 kilometers, the rock would transition from granite to basalt. A change detectable by seismic waves had been interpreted as a rock-type boundary. They drilled through 7 kilometers, no basalt, more granite. The seismic discontinuity was not a rock-type change at all. It was a metamorphic transition. The same rock under different pressure and temperature conditions, producing different seismic signatures. The internal structure of the Earth's crust was not what any model predicted. Then there was the water. At depths where no water should exist, 6 to 12 kilometers deep, far below any groundwater system, sealed in rock under enormous pressure, the drill cores were saturated with water. Not trapped water from the surface, juvenile water. Water produced by deep chemical reactions between hydrogen-bearing minerals and oxygen-bearing rocks under the heat and pressure of the deep crust. Water that had never been part of any surface hydrological system, produced in place, deep underground, in rock that was supposed to be bone dry. The temperature was also wrong. Every 1,000 meters deeper, the temperature was expected to rise by about 25 degrees Celsius. By the time drilling stopped, the rock temperature at the bottom was 180 degrees Celsius, far higher than predicted. The drilling was abandoned not because they ran out of interest, but because the heat made the rock behave like plastic. The drill bits were being destroyed. The equipment could not cope with what was actually down there. The Kola borehole was sealed and abandoned in 1995. The entire facility was demolished by 2008. The site is now a rusting ruin in a remote peninsula. The most ambitious geological drilling project in human history, closed because the Earth was too hot to continue. Number 9. The Runit Dome, a nuclear tomb in the Pacific. Cracking, filling with seawater. On Runit Island in the Marshall Islands in the remote Pacific Ocean, there is a dome. White concrete, 115 meters wide, roughly circular, sitting on a small island that barely rises above the waterline at high tide. Under it, 120,000 tons of radioactive waste. In 1946 and 1958, the United States conducted 67 nuclear tests across the Marshall Islands. The explosive yield of those tests was equivalent to 1.6 Hiroshima bombs detonated every single day for 12 years. The largest single test, Castle Bravo, in March 1954, was 1,000 times more powerful than the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It vaporized part of Runit Island, left a crater 350 feet wide and 33 feet deep. In the late 1970s, the United States agreed to clean up the Marshall Islands. They collected contaminated soil and debris from across the atoll, scraped from beaches, dug from hillsides, gathered from every irradiated surface, loaded it into dump trucks, and poured it into the cactus crater on Runit Island. Then they poured concrete on top of it, 18 inches thick. The Runit Dome was built between 1977 and 1980 by 4,000 U.S. servicemen. Workers wore minimal protective equipment. The heat made radiation suits impractical. Many were not told what they were handling. Of the 4,000 troops who formed the cleanup crew, only a few hundred are alive today. Many died of cancer. Here is what nobody told the public for decades. The dome has no bottom. It was never lined. It sits directly on porous coral sediment. From the day it was finished, seawater has been flowing in and out underneath it with every tide, washing through the radioactive waste, carrying contaminated water back into the lagoon. Every day, for 46 years. The concrete cap contains visible cracks. Columbia University chemistry professor Ivona Nikolic-Hughes examined the cracks while measuring radiation levels in 2018. She stated directly that she worried the integrity of the dome could be in jeopardy. Runit Island sits 2 meters above sea level at its highest point. By 2100, sea level rise is projected to add 1 meter to Pacific Ocean levels. Storm surges already periodically wash over the island's surface. The plutonium inside, plutonium-239, remains hazardous for more than 24,000 years. No concrete structure has ever survived for 24,000 years. This one has not survived 50 without cracking. The Marshall Islands government does not have the resources to remediate it. The U.S. government has argued that legal agreements signed in exchange for nuclear testing resolved all claims. The dome sits there, leaking, slowly, into an ocean 20 miles from human populations who use the lagoon for food and water. Number 8. Zombie viruses in the permafrost. 48,500 years frozen. Still alive. Permafrost is permanently frozen ground. It covers approximately 23 million square kilometers across the northern hemisphere, roughly a quarter of all land in the Arctic regions of Russia, Canada, Alaska, and Scandinavia. It has been frozen for thousands to millions of years. Cold, dark, oxygen-free, the perfect conditions for preservation. In 2014, French scientist Jean-Michel Clavieri at Aix-Marseille University revived a virus from a 30,000-year-old permafrost sample. He named it Pithovirus sibericum. It was infectious. After 30,000 years frozen, it still worked. In 2023, Clavieri's team published a follow-up study. They had revived 13 more ancient viruses from 7 different Siberian permafrost samples. The oldest was 48,500 years old, based on radiocarbon dating of the surrounding soil. It came from a sample taken from an underground lake 16 meters below the surface. 48,500 years. That means this virus was frozen before the last glacial maximum, before modern humans reached Europe in significant numbers, possibly while Neanderthals were still alive in Siberia. The revived viruses currently only infect amoeba, single-celled organisms. They do not infect humans or animals. That is the safety barrier Clavieri deliberately maintained in his research, but he has been explicit about what this means more broadly. The fact that amoeba-infecting viruses remain infectious after 48,500 years means that any other class of virus, ones that infect animals, ones that infect humans, could in principle survive the same duration under the same conditions. Permafrost preserves everything. Woolly mammoths, ancient horses, Neanderthal remains, and whatever pathogens lived in and around those animals 50,000 years ago. Arctic temperatures are warming 4 times faster than the global average. The permafrost is thawing. It is thawing now. As it thaws, the material inside it is exposed for the first time in tens of thousands of years, including any infectious agents that survived the freeze. Clavieri told CNN directly that he fears people regard his research as a scientific curiosity and do not perceive the prospect of ancient viruses coming back to life as a serious public health threat. As of 2025, Russian scientists are actively hunting for paleoviruses in permafrost-preserved remains of mammoths, woolly rhinos, and prehistoric horses, looking for something that should not be alive. Number 7. The Siberian methane bombs. The ground is exploding and nobody can stop it. In 2014, a reindeer herder on the Yamal Peninsula in Siberia came across something that had no immediate explanation. A crater, roughly 50 meters wide, appeared suddenly in the tundra. No impact debris, no scorch marks. The ground had simply blown outward. Walls smooth. Methane concentrations up the crater rim extraordinarily high. Since 2014, dozens of similar craters have been confirmed across the Yamal and Gaidan peninsulas, each one formed by the same process. Beneath the permafrost of western Siberia sits a layer called cryopegs, pockets of salty water that remain liquid even below freezing due to their salt concentration. Below them sit methane hydrates, ice-like crystalline structures that trap methane molecules in a solid lattice, stable under the conditions that have existed for thousands of years. As the Arctic warms, those conditions change. Surface warming thaws the active layer of permafrost above. Water percolates downward. The cryopeg absorbs it through osmosis. The pocket swells. Pressure builds. The frozen ground above cracks. The sudden pressure drop destabilizes the methane hydrates below. They release their methane instantaneously. The ground explodes. A 2024 study published in Geophysical Research Letters by Anna Morgado at the University of Cambridge confirmed this osmotic mechanism with modeling that matched the crater formation pattern. In September 2025, a further analysis confirmed that at one crater, Sayaka, sustained methane release continued years after the initial 2017 explosion. The crater keeps venting. Approximately 7,000 underground methane bubbles have been identified on the Yamal and Gaidan peninsulas using ground-penetrating radar. These are pressurized domes of soil sitting above methane accumulations, precursors to craters, each one a potential future explosion. Methane is a greenhouse gas 80 times more potent than carbon dioxide over a 20-year timescale. Siberian permafrost contains an estimated 1.7 trillion tons of organic carbon, more than twice the amount currently in the atmosphere. As it thaws and decomposes, it releases both methane and carbon dioxide. The warming it drives releases more permafrost, which releases more methane. The ground is not just thawing. In places, it is exploding, and each explosion releases the gas that causes more warming that causes more explosions. Number 6. The ancient Mercury Reservoir, a continent-scale poison buried in the ice. In 2018, a study published in Geophysical Research Letters estimated the amount of mercury stored in Northern Hemisphere permafrost. The number was staggering. Approximately 793,000 metric tons of mercury, nearly twice the amount of mercury in every other soil, ocean, and atmosphere combined, is locked inside the permafrost of the Arctic. This mercury was not put there by industry. It accumulated naturally over millennia. Mercury from volcanic outgassing, ocean chemistry, and atmospheric deposition was sequestered into the organic material of Arctic ecosystems over thousands of years and slowly incorporated into the frozen ground as permafrost advanced during glacial periods. It has been there, locked, inert, for thousands of years. As permafrost thaws, that mercury is being released into Arctic rivers, lakes, and ultimately the ocean. Mercury does not stay in inorganic form. Bacteria and sediments convert inorganic mercury into methylmercury, the highly toxic organic form that bioaccumulates in food chains. It concentrates in fish, then in the animals and people that eat the fish. At each step in the food chain, its concentration multiplies. A 2024 study tracking mercury concentrations in Arctic river systems found measurable increases in methylmercury in sediments associated with thawing permafrost catchments. The increase was not theoretical, it was measured. In rivers that communities downstream depend on. The total reservoir is 793,000 metric tons. The amount released to date is a fraction of that. But the permafrost is not going to refreeze under current trajectories. The release has begun, and it will continue for decades to centuries, regardless of any action taken now. Number 5. The underground rivers no one knew existed, a hidden hydrological world beneath the continents. Scientists mapping groundwater systems have discovered in the last decade that the subsurface hydrological world is far larger and more interconnected than anyone predicted. In 2019, researchers published results from a global deep groundwater study showing that freshwater extends to depths of 10 kilometers or more beneath the continents, far deeper than previously assumed to be accessible. The total volume of water in this deep subsurface reservoir is estimated to be equivalent to the volume of the world's oceans. Not surface water, underground, locked in rock, moving at meters per year rather than meters per second. Disconnected from rainfall and surface recharge over millions of years. Ancient water, in some cases, that has been isolated underground since before humans evolved. In 2013, miners drilling in a Canadian mine 2.4 kilometers below the surface found water trapped in ancient rock. Analysis showed it had been isolated underground for 1.5 to 2.7 billion years, the oldest water ever found on Earth. It tasted extremely salty and contained dissolved gases, including hydrogen and helium. When they tested it for signs of biological activity, they found chemical signatures consistent with living microbes, organisms living in water that had been sealed underground for over 1 billion years. In 2024, researchers mapping the deep subsurface under the Sahara Desert confirmed an ancient river system buried beneath the sand, a massive drainage network that flowed into the Paleolake of a now-vanished megabasin, traced using satellite radar penetrating the sand. Hundreds of kilometers of ancient river channels, dried and buried, preserving in sediment the entire paleohydrological history of a region that is now among the driest on Earth. The ground beneath every continent contains rivers that stopped flowing millions of years ago, lakes that dried before humans existed, water that has been sealed underground since before complex life appeared on the surface, and in some of it, possibly, life that has continued evolving in complete isolation from everything above. Number 4. The Lost World under Antarctica ice. Lakes buried under 4 kilometers of ice, with life in them. Antarctica has been covered by ice for approximately 34 million years. Beneath that ice, beneath kilometers of frozen water, there are lakes. Over 400 subglacial lakes have been identified using airborne radar surveys and seismic measurements. The largest, Lake Vostok, is 250 kilometers long, 50 kilometers wide, and up to 1 kilometer deep. Buried under 3.7 to 4.3 kilometers of ice, it has been sealed from the surface for an estimated 15 to 25 million years. In February 2012, Russian scientists finally broke through to Lake Vostok after decades of drilling. The water that came up the borehole was immediately refrozen by the extreme pressure of the surrounding ice. Analysis of the refrozen material, contamination controlled to exclude any surface material introduced by the drilling, found genetic signatures of bacteria, living bacteria, in water that has been sealed under 4 kilometers of ice for millions of years. The conditions in Lake Vostok are extraordinary. Near freezing temperatures, no sunlight has ever reached it, no surface photosynthesis, extremely high dissolved oxygen concentration because the overlying ice slowly compresses oxygen into the water rather than excluding it. An ecosystem running entirely on chemical energy without any solar input. The organisms in Lake Vostok, if confirmed, have been evolving in complete isolation for millions of years, on a separate evolutionary trajectory from everything on the surface. What millions of years of isolated evolution and extreme cold and darkness produces is unknown. The samples are limited. The contamination risk from drilling makes definitive confirmation difficult. But the discovery that liquid water and potentially life exists under kilometers of Antarctica ice has direct implications for what might be hiding under the ice shells of Europa and Enceladus and other moons in the outer solar system. If life can exist in Lake Vostok, it raises the probability that life exists in the subsurface oceans of other worlds. The most significant discovery about extraterrestrial life may already be buried under the ice at the bottom of the planet. Number 3. The supervolcano pressure changes no one is talking about. Under Yellowstone National Park in Wyoming sits a magma chamber, 80 kilometers long, 20 kilometers wide, positioned beneath one of the most geologically active regions in North America. The last 3 super eruptions from this system, 2.1 million years ago, 1.3 million years ago, and 640,000 years ago, each ejected volumes of material thousands of times larger than the 1980 Mount St. Helens eruption. The Yellowstone caldera is continuously monitored. The University of Utah seismograph stations tracks every tremor. The USGS Yellowstone Volcano Observatory measures ground deformation, hydrothermal activity, and gas emissions in real time. What the monitoring has found is not evidence of an imminent eruption. The USGS consistently and clearly states that a supereruption at Yellowstone in the foreseeable future is highly unlikely. The magma chamber is estimated to be 5 to 15% molten material, far below the roughly 50% thought necessary to drive a major eruption. What has been found is more subtle and more interesting. Between 2004 and 2010, the Yellowstone caldera floor rose by 25 centimeters, a rapid period of uplift driven by hydrothermal fluid intrusion into the shallow crust. Then it subsided. Between 2023 and 2024, GPS stations detected renewed uplift in the northern caldera area, several millimeters of ground deformation over months. The system breathes, it inflates and deflates. The hydrothermal system, the geysers, the hot springs, the fumaroles, is the surface expression of an enormous heat engine below. That engine has periods of increased activity and periods of calm. The current monitoring data does not indicate a threat, but Yellowstone is one of the few places on Earth where even minor changes in underground pressure have implications for millions of people across the continent. If a supereruption ever did occur, the ashfall alone, modeled by the USGS, would cover the continental United States in up to a foot of ash across a broad swath. Crop failures, respiratory illness, structural collapse of buildings under ash weight, a global temperature reduction from volcanic aerosols in the stratosphere. The economic and humanitarian scale would exceed anything in recorded history. The monitoring data shows a system that is active, dynamic, and variable, not erupting, not on the verge of erupting, but not quiet either. Number 2. What the Earth's inner core is actually doing. It stopped, then reversed, and we have no idea why. The Earth has a solid inner core, a ball of iron roughly the size of the moon at the very center of the planet, sitting inside a liquid outer core of molten iron and nickel. The inner core rotates independently of the rest of the planet. In January 2023, seismologists Yi Yang and Chaodong Song at Peking University published a paper in Nature Geoscience based on 60 years of seismic wave data. Their analysis of how seismic waves from repeated earthquakes at the same locations travel through the inner core over time showed something that had never been confirmed before. The inner core had been spinning faster than the mantle and crust above it. Then, around 2009, it stopped its faster rotation relative to the surface, and since approximately 2010, it appears to have begun rotating slightly slower than the surface, in the opposite relative direction. The inner core oscillated, from spinning ahead of the surface to falling behind it, a reversal of relative rotation. The exact magnitude of the rotation changes is tiny, fractions of a degree per year. The physical mechanisms proposed include gravitational coupling between the inner core and the mantle, and electromagnetic coupling between the core and the overlying liquid outer core. Neither explanation is complete. What the inner core does directly affects the geodynamo, the process that generates Earth's magnetic field. Changes in relative rotation between the inner core, the liquid outer core, and the mantle affect the pattern of fluid flow in the liquid core that drives the magnetic field. The magnetic field that protects the atmosphere, that keeps the solar wind from stripping away the oceans. The inner core's reversal does not mean the magnetic field is about to collapse. The changes are too small and too gradual for that. But it is a reminder that deep inside the Earth, something is happening that we have no way to directly observe and only partially understand. We are inferring the behavior of the center of the planet from the timing of earthquake waves passing through it, and what those waves are telling us is that the center of the Earth is doing something it may not have done in living human memory. Number 1. The fifth ocean under the ground. More water beneath the surface than in all surface oceans combined. In 2014, a team of geophysicists at Northwestern University published a paper in the journal Science describing the discovery of an enormous water reservoir hidden hundreds of kilometers beneath the Earth's surface. Not liquid water, not ice, water chemically bound inside a mineral called ringwoodite, a high-pressure form of alluvium that exists in the transition zone between the upper and lower mantle, 410 to 660 kilometers below the surface. The discovery came from seismic wave analysis. Earthquake waves slow down when they pass through wet rock compared to dry rock at the same temperature and pressure. The seismic signature from earthquakes passing through the transition zone showed velocities consistent with water-saturated ringwoodite. The water is not free. It is locked inside the crystal structure of the mineral itself. But it is there, and the quantity is staggering. The estimated volume of water stored in this deep mantle reservoir is approximately 3 times the volume of water in Earth's surface oceans combined. 3 oceans, buried 500 kilometers down, inside rock, 500 kilometers below the ground you are standing on right now. 10 things found buried under the ground that scientists did not fully predict and have not fully explained. The deepest hole ever drilled, discovering water and heat where none should exist. A leaking nuclear tomb on a sinking island holding 24,000 years of danger in 46-year-old cracking concrete. Viruses 48,500 years old pulled from frozen ground and found still alive. Ground in Siberia exploding from methane pressure building under thawing tundra. A continent-scale Mercury reservoir the size of twice every ocean's Mercury budget beginning to thaw. A hidden hydrological world of ancient underground rivers and billion-year-old water. An Antarctic lake under 4 kilometers of ice with living organisms that have not touched the surface in millions of years. A supervolcano under a national park that breathes in and out on timescales nobody fully understands. The inner core of the planet reversing its relative rotation around 2009 for reasons that are still being worked out. And more water buried 500 kilometers underground than in every ocean on the surface combined. The surface of the Earth is what you can see. What is underneath it is still being discovered. Subscribe to Cosmic Hives. See you in the next one.